big spike in prices at the pump, the product prices rise faster than the underlying crude, for example.
Diesel is up, rates feel soft, and most truckers have no idea Iran has anything to do with it. But it does, and the way it's hitting your wallet right now is not the way anybody's explaining it. I was talking to a buddy of mine who runs 3 trucks out of Memphis, and he said something that stuck with me. He said the load board looks fine, the rates look okay on paper, but every time he goes to fill up, or every time he tries to book a lane 2 weeks out, something just feels off. Like the numbers don't quite add up the way they used to. And he couldn't put his finger on it. That's actually what I want to get into today, because the connection between what's happening in the Middle East and what's happening in American trucking is real, but it's not the obvious straight line that people think it is. There are a few layers to it, and each one hits differently depending on what you haul, where you run, and how your business is structured. So let's start with fuel, because that's where most drivers feel it first. The thing is, the United States doesn't actually import a ton of oil directly from Iran. So on the surface, you'd think a conflict there doesn't move the needle much for us. But oil is a global commodity, and the market doesn't care about your borders. When there's serious instability anywhere near the Strait of Hormuz, which is this narrow waterway that something like 20% of the world's oil passes through on any given day, traders get nervous. And when traders get nervous, they price that nervousness into futures contracts before a single barrel of oil actually goes anywhere. So diesel goes up not because supply actually dropped, but because the market is betting that supply might drop. That premium gets baked into the price you see at the pump, sometimes within 48 hours of a headline. I was watching this happen in real time back when there was that whole tanker situation a few years back, and I remember diesel jumping almost 30 cents in about a week and a half. Nothing had actually changed in terms of physical supply. Refineries were running, tankers were moving, but the futures market had spooked, and that was enough. So when you're looking at your fuel costs right now and trying to figure out why they're creeping up, that's a big part of what's going on. It's not about a shortage that exists yet. It's about one that the market thinks might exist, and that distinction matters because it means the pressure can ease pretty quickly if the situation de-escalates. But it can also spike hard and fast if it gets worse. And the other thing worth knowing about fuel is that refinery margins play into this too. When crude oil prices are volatile, refiners get cautious. They're less willing to run at full capacity because they don't want to be sitting on a lot of refined product if the price swings against them. So even when crude stabilizes a bit, you can still see diesel prices stay elevated because refinery output tightened during the volatile period, and it takes a while to catch back up. So the fuel hit often lasts longer than the actual news cycle that caused it. Now here's where it gets a little more complicated, and this is the part that I feel like most people skip over when they're talking about this stuff. Trucking doesn't just feel the Iran conflict through fuel prices. It also feels it through freight. Because when oil prices go up, certain industries slow down pretty fast. Retail margins get squeezed. Manufacturing input costs go up. Consumer spending shifts. And all of that changes what's moving and where it's going. Some of the lanes that were really solid 6 months ago start softening because the shipper on the other end is dealing with their own cost pressures and they're moving less volume or renegotiating contracts. At the same time, you get some lanes that heat up. Anything related to energy infrastructure tends to move more when there's global instability because domestic producers here start ramping up. That means more pipe, more equipment, more chemicals, more rig components moving around Texas and North Dakota and the Permian Basin. So if you're already running energy country, you might actually see a bump. But if you're running consumer goods lanes, general freight, retail distribution, that's where you're more likely to feel the squeeze. I talked to a dispatcher out of Dallas a few weeks ago, and she said her energy freight had picked up noticeably. Like her guys were busier than they'd been in a while, but she knew other carriers in her area running grocery and retail stuff who were struggling to find loads that made sense at the right rate. Same regional market, completely different experience depending on what you haul. So the impact isn't uniform. It depends a lot on your freight mix and your lanes. And that's worth actually thinking about, because a lot of drivers just kind of absorb whatever hits them without connecting it to the bigger picture. There's also a port and import freight angle that doesn't get talked about enough. When global shipping gets disrupted, even partially, importers start doing something called front-loading. They rush orders in before things get worse. trying to get inventory positioned before shipping costs spike further or transit times get unpredictable. You saw a version of this during COVID when everybody was trying to get containers moving at the same time. When that happens, you get a short burst of drayage volume at major ports, more containers needing to move inland, more demand for intermodal trucking. So some drivers actually pick up work in that initial scramble phase. But it doesn't last, because once the importer has their inventory stacked up, they slow down ordering until they work through it, and the volume dries up again. So if you're doing port work or intermodal and you saw a little uptick recently, that might be part of what's going on, but it's worth knowing it can reverse pretty quickly. There's also an equipment angle here that almost nobody is talking about, and I think it matters. A lot of truck components, not the whole truck, but specific parts, come from supply chains that run through Asia, and some of those shipping routes and insurance costs for vessels moving through certain waters have gone up because of the broader instability in the region. When a shipper has to pay more to insure cargo moving through riskier waters, that cost eventually works its way into the price of goods, including parts. It's not dramatic. It's not like parts stores are out of stock on everything, but there's a slow creep in pricing for certain components, and lead times on some specialty items have gotten a little longer. If you're managing a fleet and you've noticed that your parts costs are slightly higher than they were a year ago, some of that is just inflation, but some of it traces back to global supply chain friction that this conflict is making worse. Tires are a good example of this. A significant portion of the materials that go into commercial truck tires move through supply chains that are sensitive to global shipping conditions. The tire manufacturers won't come out and say the price increase is because of Iran, but when you stack up elevated shipping insurance, longer lead times on raw materials, and tighter refinery output affecting petroleum-based rubber compounds, you end up with prices that are higher than they'd otherwise be. It's death by 1,000 cuts, and each cut has a different label, but they're all coming from the same general direction. The insurance situation in trucking is also worth mentioning because it's already brutal, and this kind of global instability tends to make it worse, not immediately, but over time. Reinsurance markets, which are basically the insurance companies that insure insurance companies, are heavily affected by geopolitical risk. When there's sustained conflict in a region that matters to global oil markets, reinsurance costs go up, and that eventually filters down into commercial trucking premiums. It's slow and it's indirect, but it's real, and if your renewal is coming up in the next 6 months, you might see that reflected. There's also a driver behavior side to this that I find really interesting. When fuel prices spike and rates feel uncertain, you see carriers start making decisions that change how capacity moves around the market. Some smaller operators park trucks temporarily because the math doesn't work at current fuel prices and current rates. That tightens available capacity, which should theoretically push rates up. But at the same time, larger carriers that have better fuel programs and tighter operations can absorb the pressure longer and start undercutting on rate to hold volume. So you can end up in this weird situation where capacity is tighter on paper, but rates don't reflect it, because the carriers still running are competing harder for the available freight. If you've ever wondered why rates sometimes feel disconnected from what logic says they should be, that dynamic is a big part of it. So what do you actually do with all of this? I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think the honest answer is that most of what's happening right now is noise that you can't control. But there are a few things that actually make sense to do. One of them is to pay closer attention to your fuel surcharge structure. A lot of carriers, especially smaller ones, have FSC agreements that were set up when diesel was in a different range, and they haven't revisited them. If your FSC isn't keeping up with where diesel is right now and where it might go, that's money you're leaving on the table on every load. It's worth having that conversation with your brokers and shippers now, before diesel climbs another 40 or 50 cents and you're already underwater. The other thing I'd think about is lane diversity. If you're heavily concentrated in lanes that are driven by consumer discretionary spending, meaning stuff that people buy when they feel good about the economy and cut back on when they don't, it might be worth looking at whether you can pick up some freight that's a little more recession and volatility resistant. Food, agriculture, industrial materials, some healthcare freight. These sectors don't boom, but they also don't crater when things get shaky globally. A lot of drivers resist this because they've built relationships and they know their lanes. And I get that. But having at least some of your business in staple freight is like having a hedge. It smooths things out when the more volatile stuff dries up. It's also worth looking at your deadhead percentage right now, because that's one of the fastest ways fuel price increases actually kill your margin. When diesel was cheaper, running 150 empty miles to get under a good load felt like a reasonable trade. At current prices, and with where things might be heading, that calculus changes. Every empty mile is just pure cost, and if you're not being really deliberate about repositioning, you can bleed a lot of money without realizing it. Some drivers I know have started being much more selective about accepting loads that position them well for their next pickup, even if the load itself pays a little less, just because the alternative is a long empty run that wipes out the rate advantage anyway. I also think there's a mindset shift that's worth making, and I know that sounds a little vague, so let me be specific. A lot of drivers and small fleet owners operate kind of month to month without a strong sense of what their real cost per mile is down to the decimal. When fuel is cheap and rates are good, that works fine. But when you're in a period where input costs are rising unpredictably and rate pressure is real, not knowing your exact numbers is genuinely dangerous. I remember talking to a guy who had been running his truck for 8 years and he thought he was making money. But when we actually sat down and looked at his fuel costs, his maintenance accruals, his insurance, his payment, and his deadhead percentage, he was basically breaking even on a good month. And he had no idea. That's a situation where a sustained fuel spike can flip you from breaking even to losing money before you even notice it's happening. And the thing is, that's a solvable problem. It's not complicated to know your number. You add up every fixed and variable cost you have on a monthly basis, divide it by your loaded miles, and that's your floor. Every rate you accept has to be above that number, or you're going backward. A lot of drivers know this in theory, but haven't actually done the math in a while, and when the market was forgiving, it didn't matter much. Right now, with costs moving around the way they are, it matters a lot. The broader situation in Iran is still developing, and nobody really knows how it plays out from here. If the conflict stays contained, fuel markets will probably settle, and a lot of this pressure eases. If it escalates and the Strait of Hormuz gets seriously disrupted, you're looking at a different scenario, one where diesel prices could move significantly and stay elevated for months. Most analysts right now are saying the more severe outcome is not their base case, but they're also not ruling it out, and markets are pricing in some probability of it, which is why you're already seeing some of this pressure. There's also a longer-term thing worth keeping an eye on, which is how this affects fleet investment decisions across the industry. When operators are uncertain about fuel costs and freight demand at the same time, they tend to hold off on buying new equipment. That means the truck order books slow down, which eventually affects resale values on used trucks as fewer trades come through. If you're thinking about upgrading your truck in the next year or two, the timing of that decision is going to be shaped in part by how this situation resolves. It's worth tracking, not obsessively, but just keeping it in mind as part of the picture. The point is, this is not background noise anymore. It's already in your fuel costs. It's already in some of your freight rates. It's starting to show up in parts and insurance in ways that are subtle but real. And the best thing you can do is understand the mechanism, know where it's hitting you specifically, and make adjustments that put you in a stronger position regardless of how it shakes out. Because the one thing that's true in every market cycle is that the operators who know their numbers and stay adaptable are the ones still running when things stabilize. The ones who just kept their head down and hoped it resolved itself are the ones who got caught.